My name is Kay Kotan. I'm the director of the Center for Multiplying Disciples for the Arkansas Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Awesome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
I'm a little embarrassed to tell people this, but I figure we've all got that person in our life that we're a little embarrassed to tell people about. So in my life, it's Bill. And it's because Bill thinks, I don't even know how to describe it. Bill thinks that Jesus bought the Scooby-Doo van and drove around in the 1970s pretending to be a rock star. I don't really know, but please just tell Bill who Jesus really is.
For me, besides being the happy hippie, right? Jesus is just kind of that rock. You know, when sometimes you feel alone, you're never alone. Sometimes when you feel like you don't have the answers, you really don't, you have the answers. You just have to listen. So it's that continuous companion through life is the way I like to think about Jesus.
See, Jesus is a continuing companion, not a hippie. No, waiting for Jeremy.
No, I heard rock. She said rock, and that would be like rock star, hippie. There we go.
Y'all can twist anything. I can see that.
In life, we all hear what we want to hear. And no, tell us.
But in his day, I think Jesus was a hippie because, wearing, sandals, even though that was the shoe of the day, hanging out with people that everyone else wouldn't hang out with, doing things that other people wouldn't be doing. And isn't that sometimes what we think about as hippies? They're not like everybody else.
And I think God purposely chose to become incarnate at a time when he could wear sandals all day, every day.
Good idea, because that's why I moved south, right? So I could wear sandals more of the year.
And that says a lot about God, because I would have chosen to become incarnate in a time where I had air conditioning.
Oh. There's still a chance.
So tell us a story, Kay. It could be from your own life. It can be from the Bible. You can just make up a story if you want, but just anything that'll shed some light on how you understand Jesus.
Where in the state of our United Methodist Church and our denomination right now, so many are in this place of scarcity and they're immobilized by it, which is just breaking my heart that all of these people still need to know Jesus. And we're so scared of what's going to happen with our denomination that we are forgetting our purpose. And so where I'm being fed at this point is not to look at the situation of our denomination, because regardless if there's a United Methodist Church or what it's going to look like, whether it's 1, 2, 3 branches or something else, people still need to know Jesus. And if we continue to work on that piece of it, I think we're all going to be okay, regardless of how all of this comes out. So that's where I like to focus. And that's where I'm seeing him show up in ways when I'm teaching or leading and those light bulbs go off in people. You can see it in their eyes that there's a movement. And that's kind of what keeps me going at this point.
I've heard you speak a couple of times, and one of them you told this really cool story about someone basically came to know Jesus at a gas station that you went to all the time.
Exactly.
Tell us a story about a time, you can tell that story or any story about a time when someone came to know Jesus in an unexpected way.
Well, I think you forced her to tell that story now because everybody listening's curious.
Oh,
you're a devilish young man.
I only look young.
So here it goes.
Okay.
The gas station.
You can tell a different story after. It was not my intention to.
No. It's a profound story. So I frequented a gas station for, at that time, my drink of choice was Diet Coke. And one time I came and it was a newer person at the counter and I set my drink down and she asked the craziest question. She said, "So what kind of coach are you?" And I said, "What do you mean? What kind of coach?" And she said, "Well, your license plate." She had seen my license plate and my Missouri license plate said Coach K. And I said, "Oh, that." And I said, laughingly, I said, "Well, it's not a basketball coach, obviously, being short." And she laughed. And I said, "It's a really unusual thing. I coach pastors and churches." And she was fascinated by that and asked a few more questions. So as I began to frequent that more, Sandy and I built a relationship. And, I just knew that at some point there was going to be a next time, a next question, a next step. So one day I approached the counter, and she had a friend that was kind of leaning against the counter, and they were talking, and she said, "Hey, I want to introduce you to my friend." And just at that moment, I was told, "This is the time you're supposed to take your next step." And I'm going, "No, this is not the time." I'm standing in the middle of a convenience store. There's another man that I've never met standing here. And it's like, it's not a good day. No, this is the day. It was the nudge, and then it was the pound on the head. So I said, do you remember just a few weeks ago where there was a scratch off ticket winner, and it was with a new employee, and they paid over drawer limit, and they weren't supposed to validate it. They had to call in a manager. And she said, "I heard about that." And I said, "Well, that was the beginning of what my husband referred to as his lucky week." And at this point, she's literally leaning on the counter on both elbows. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm thinking, God, this is really not the time or the place. And it's like, nope, this is it. This is it. You're up to bat. You better swing. And I said, so the reason he calls that his lucky week is it started with that scratcher ticket. And then about 4 days later, he collapsed at work. And he collapsed, lost consciousness. Luckily, it was at a time when other employees were around, and they called 911. It just so happened that the ambulance was only a few blocks away, and they had to use the paddles on him twice. He regained consciousness long enough in the ambulance to divert them for where they were going to go, to kind of a premier cardiology hospital. And I said, so Sandy, I tell you all of this because my husband survived the Widowmaker. About 85% of the time, they don't. And I said, so, I do these crazy things of coaching pastors and churches across the nation. I travel all over and do speaking and write books. I said, because I want people to know that Jesus that was there with me during that whole thing. And I believe in divine intervention, that ambulance was where it was, and the employees were where they were, and that cardiologist was where they were, so that 15% of the time that he was saved. And I said, Sandy, that's why I do what I do. And as you could tell, I couldn't say any more at that point, and bid her farewell. And so I went in about a week later, and she said, "I've been waiting to see you." And I said, "You have?" And she said, "Yes." She said, I normally work Sundays, but I'm really wanting to get back to church. Can you help connect me with something that maybe goes on a Saturday night?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I can." And she goes on to say that she is a de-churched United Methodist. We had never talked about denominational things whatsoever. So it began this relationship of connecting her with the life of a congregation, because I went up to bat in a convenience store.
That's a great story.
Awesome. I've had my week of miracles this week too, and I just wanted you to know about it, because as anybody that listens to this show will tell you, Jeremy makes it abundantly clear he does no work whatsoever on the show. Mm-hmm.
It's like a badge of honor, really.
Yeah. But this week, you're on the show because Jeremy did some work. He reached out to you and asked you to be on the show.
He did.
So I just want everybody that's listening to know that this has been a miracle week for me.
And he did quite in advance too, by the way.
I know. I mean, it's possible that I exaggerate the amount of work Bill does for effect. Or maybe I'm just like hoping that it'll be true, and I figure if I speak it into existence enough times that it'll happen.
It'll happen. There you go.
Yeah. So you've written a number of books, and you've done a lot of work with churches around. And one of the things that you really love to do is hospitality. Mm-hmm. So just say a little bit about what hospitality means to you, and then some example or a story of how you've seen it lived out really well.
Yeah. I am pretty passionate about hospitality. And the reason I am is that's the first impression. And you never get a second chance to make a first impression, right? That's the old cliche. And I believe that is so true in churches. And so even before you get on property, the open front door at this point is, as we know, our websites and our social media presence. And that's the first place that we may never get an opportunity to entertain a guest if we aren't first hospitable on our website Too often we build websites for us that are already in the church. What if that opening page was about those that were looking, our seekers? And then once you're on property, those first impressions, people make pretty instant decisions anymore. And we think we're friendly. Most churches, every church claims to be the friendliest church, right? Every church is the friendliest church. But I have become a professional guest. I'm usually in a different congregation every Sunday. And I can tell you, as much as we talk about it, it is not practiced very much. The number of times that I can go in and out of a church, be there for an entire hour and have no human interaction whatsoever is more common than you'd think. And I always leave with my heart saddened to say, what if I was a first-time guest and just had that experience? And we may never get another opportunity. And it's not just about hospitality, but hospitality is the first step so that we might be able to connect with them and teach them about Jesus. So that's why I'm passionate.
Can you tell us some interesting or unique types of hospitality you've witnessed in churches, though? Because I think every church is unique and has their own spin.
Yeah. I think it is layers of human contact. Sometimes we think about one layer. And so where I see it done really well is it starts in the parking lot, with people helping park and direct. How many church has just one door? Most churches have multiple doors, and just even finding where you're supposed to go in, is sometimes a challenge. And then if you go in a door where there isn't anybody, so you start in the parking lot, you start an exterior door, and then the interior door to the worship experience. And then what if there was a connector that kind of helped you navigate that whole experience? So when you have those multiple layers is when I see people connect the best. But I also think you have to have kind of that intuition, because some people want to come in and just slide into the back pew and slide out. They're just, that's all they can do at that point, and they want to be invisible. So we have to kind of learn how to dance with people and know where they're at. But it also means that we need to give up the back pews in order for our guests to have a place to slide in and do that, right? And so it's the multiple layers that I see that they do it really well. And I would say the other really cool thing is when we think about hospitality beyond Sunday morning, what does hospitality look like during the week? And so when churches begin to think about that, it can open up a whole new conversation to say, so how are we doing with the Boy Scouts? How are we doing with the MOPS? How are we doing with the Zumba class? And begin to think about hospitality from that standpoint. So churches that are doing it well are well beyond the Sunday morning experience.
The front door is disappearing on churches. I've served at churches and currently serve at a church where even on Sunday, the front door is locked, that they expect people to use every other door. How important is the front door?
I think it's not necessarily the front door as what's the door that makes sense based on where they're parking.
Right.
The number of times I've been to a church and you have to wait for somebody to get out of their car and follow them because you don't know which one. And I know some people are a little wigged out by security at this point. And I get that. But at the same time, if we're not the place where the doors are open and are ready and expecting, looking forward to receiving guests, then who is, right? And so if we really are going to be hospitable, we have somebody at every exterior door.
Every exterior door. Huh?
Yes.
Okay. Let's say that I have a church that worships, about 100 in a town of about 8,000. And I want to build a hospitality plan from the ground up. What would you tell me to start with?
I would start with a person or two that you see that as a spiritual gift. And they intuitively get what that means. And they're practicing it, even though it may not even be a team or an intentional team. I would go to them. I use the I see in you. So, here's what I see in you as your spiritual gifts. People are drawn to you. You've never met a stranger. I call it the Patty syndrome. I have a friend named Patty, and Patty knows everybody's names between 2 floors in an elevator that she's never met. Every congregation usually has a Patty or two. So I would start with the Patties and then begin to build in an intentional process and some training around that. Those two, they build their team and they begin to think about hospitality not only on Sunday, but throughout the week. But then I think we take it a step further to say, what does a DNA or a culture of hospitality for the whole congregation look like? So Jim Osier is one of my favorite authors. He wrote Clip In. He's retired at the North Texas Conference. And he does a really great job in that book about talking about building a culture of hospitality. His co-writer was part of Southwest Airlines. Great hospitality, right? We could learn from them. And they talk about doing congregational training once a year. At least once a year, we talk about how does a congregation be hospitable? Because again, you can have a great hospitality team, but somebody could make some sort of comment innocently, we hope innocently, that could drive somebody away too. So there's a bigger piece of hospitality.
How important is it for the pastors of congregations to model this for their congregations?
I think obviously it's very important for them to model it. The problem is we can't be solely dependent on the pastor. That's the concern is sometimes we think, well, that's the pastor's job to receive new people. And we limit ourselves when the only person doing hospitality is the pastor, because then the guest is building a relationship with the pastor and not with the congregation or other people. So you begin this pastor-centric model, which limits us to about 80 to 100. And by the way, the average congregation in America is about 75. This is one of the pieces that I think is the reason for that, is we're so pastor-centric. So I think, especially to begin with, the pastor needs to model it so they can see it. If they've never seen it, they can't do it. But then it soon needs to be passed off as a laity team approach.
I'm going to give you a chance just to say a couple of words. One, to all my pastor friends who have control issues and might not want to pass it off. I mean, you might be talking to one of them right now. And then another word, like Methodism starts, and Methodism at its best was a lay-driven movement. I mean, there were circuit riders that showed up once a month and the local people ran the church. So how do you get your pastor friends with control issues to give up some control?
There's some pointing going on here.
Yes. And how do you empower people to reclaim that kind of identity of part of what it means to be, well, first part of what it means to be Christian, and then more specifically for me, at least, what it meant to be Methodist in the beginning.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's what our Wesleyan roots are. It was a laity movement, right? And when you look at early Methodism, it was rampant and it grew so quickly. And it was because it was a laity movement. Here I'm sitting with pastors, so I need to be careful. But when the more professionalization that happened with clergy, the more power was in clergy, and lay people were less and less empowered to do the work that I think they're meant to do. And so pastors need to be equippers, less than doers. So what if we had really great preachers that brought a great word that was contextual to help move people in the pew beyond pew potatoes? And then we empowered, and even if we expected, I would even go so far as to expected that our lay people are the ones that actually do the ministry. And so then as we have pastoral changes, it isn't this big stop and start kind of thing. It continues because the laity own their own ministry.
I feel like our structure with our committees and everything, if we do it correctly, pastors really should be plug and play. And because you're putting it in the hands of our laity. And you're right, we've kind of lost that with the professionalization of pastors. Yeah.
And I think that there is, if we're going to cast blame, not that that's what we're here to do, but we all own a part of that. Sure. You know, we're just not pointing at clergy because laity allowed it to happen as well. So there's plenty to go around. But the thing is, we now know better, so we can do better. Yeah. And I often say to pastors that if you leave an appointment and it crashes and burns when you walk out the door, that is not on the next pastor, that is on you, because you built it around you. You didn't build it for kingdom purposes. But you're absolutely right that whether you're in traditional structure with your 4 administrative teams or you're in simplified structure, the whole thing is for the lay to actually own it. But the number of times I've been to church council meetings and the pastor is running it, that is not the intention. But too many times that's what happens because out of maybe your word of control or agenda or whatever the case may be. And again, it disempowers. I often tell the story about the bus. Can we tell a story about the bus? Okay. So when you go on a trip, you always want to make sure you know what you're supposed to pack. And I like going to the beach, someplace warm, less humid, by the way, too, but warm, sunny, and nice. So if we're going to go on there, what do we need to pack, right? Swimsuits and sunscreen, sunglasses, flip-flops, shorts, T-shirts, right? So we already know what we need to pack. Everybody's prepared. They've packed. And we have an assigned seat, not only what bus we get on, but we know what seat we sit in because of our spiritual gifts, right? And so we're going on a really nice bus. We're going to sing karaoke along the way, and we're going to watch some great movies, and it's going to be a great trip. And, we're a state-of-the-art kind of bus, so we have a GPS, and we all have agreed where we're going. We're going to the beach. Nice, sunny, warm place. So we start heading down the road, and we all know that there's some things that are going to happen. Unplanned things will happen. Detours, potholes, construction. All of those things, but it doesn't change where we're going. And then even though we have a great bathroom on that bus, there still comes a time when we got to stop and stretch our legs and get out. And so we all get back on the bus and we start heading down the road again. Destination hasn't changed. But we look up front and something has changed, and that's the driver. I think of that as the appointment system in the United Methodist Church. We haven't changed where we're going. We haven't changed our giftedness and where we're supposed to be. We haven't changed our preparation for getting there. We've changed the driver. And I have yet to meet a pastor who wouldn't love to be able to go into a church and say, my laity own the mission and vision. This is where we're headed. I just got to get in and drive the bus to the destination that they've already determined.
You could sub Baptist or Presbyterian or
Absolutely.
Episcopalian or Lutheran or all those people that claim not to be a part of a denomination.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How does a laity or how does a church pick that destination?
So, great question. Every church has the same purpose. Every church has the same purpose. And too many times we spend too much time trying to figure out what it is. And Jesus told us we're to go and make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's why every church exists. I don't care what denomination or where you're at. So let's just take that till Jesus comes back and tells us something else. That's our purpose. Okay? But every church looks different. Have you noticed, right? No two churches look alike. And that's because their vision is different. And the vision comes from the needs of the community, intersecting with the gifts of the congregation, intersecting with the passions of the leaders. When you find the sweet spot of those three things coming together, that helps you determine the unique way, God's preferred future for how you live out the mission of making disciples. And I think that process goes with both the congregation leaders and the pastor. It starts as a congregational visioning approach, then it goes to leaders, and then the pastor kind of finishes up and it gets blessed by the leadership. Too often, I think pastors go away and do visioning on their own. It's their vision. And so when they leave, they take the vision with them because it was never the congregation's vision. So part of it is the approach and why we do it, but the part of it comes from the why of the mission field, not because of one particular person.
Sometimes, though, I think we overcomplicate the vision when really a lot of times all we have to do is open the door and look outside around us.
Yeah. Too often we think we know our neighborhood when we really don't know our neighborhood, especially if we become a commuter church, which a drive-in church, those that just commute in, and they're not part of the community anymore, so they don't know who their neighbor is. I actually had a church I was working with, not in Arkansas, and they said, we're afraid of our neighborhood. You're afraid to walk your neighborhood. Yep, we're afraid to walk our neighborhood. And so I said to them, how can you serve your neighborhood when you're unwilling to walk your neighborhood and look people in the eye? So does that mean you can no longer serve this mission field? I mean, I think we have to wrestle with those kinds of questions of who is our neighbor and what are their needs? And are we willing to use our gifts and passions to reach them for Christ?
we recently made the decision to no longer do our trunk or treat program for two reasons. One, it wasn't serving the mission of the church at all. We were just passing out candy.
Yeah.
And the second reason is, and this is something I've been screaming about for years, is trunk or treat started because we're afraid of our neighbors.
True. That's true. Yeah, it certainly did.
And we don't want to perpetuate that. So we're replacing it with something that is going to serve our neighborhood instead.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, if we talk specifically about trunk or treat or things that are like that, is we've got 300 people in our parking lot or 500 people, and we like, woo, it's exciting because 300 people passed over your asphalt. So what? And we didn't see that as an opportunity to build relationships. And so if we're not seeing that as a relationship building opportunity to get to know our neighbors, then we're putting a whole lot of energy forward without any return. But we still think that they're going to show up on Sunday.
Yeah. Well, first, the so what is I said a prayer with the leaders before, so I get to count all those in my worship attendance for vital signs. And just to clarify, when Bill says we, he means the church he serves. Me and him and the Happy Hippie Jesus Show have made no decisions about trunk or treat.
That would be a long commute to be able to do trunk or treat.
If a congregation wanted to get to know their neighborhood or wanted to start engaging with their community, where are some places or ways they might start that? Or you could tell a story about a church that
did that.
Yeah. That would be even better.
Yeah. When I was doing some consultation processes with some of the churches, how they did their community survey was a great indicator of how open they were going to be to receiving next steps recommendations. And this particular church, here's what we asked them to do. Get to know your community by starting this way. Less intimidating. We didn't ask them to knock on doors, but less intimidating to say, if you were to go talk to the principal at the school, but more importantly, maybe the school nurse and the school counselor, what would they tell you about the community? What are the greatest needs? What's going on with the kids? How could the church be helpful? And I always love to ask the next question is, what do you know about, fill in the name of your church? What do you know about First United Methodist Church? Community perception is important for us to realize what that is on the street. You duplicate that process with the fire chief and the police chief and community services lead. And all of those are the same questions. And then we ask each church person who's working on this conversation starter too to say, would you ask 5 people in your neighborhood you work with, you walk with, and just say, what do you think the greatest need of our community is? And then how do you think the church could be helpful in addressing that? And then what do you know about First United Methodist Church? That kind of information is invaluable for us to begin to learn about our community. Now, I do have to say that we sometimes, most of the time, stop with the primary food, shelter, clothing. A whole lot of social entities take care of that. And it's a good thing. I'm saying it's a good thing. But what makes us different is Jesus, right? And so I always ask the question then, go deeper, peel the onion back a little bit further beyond food, shelter, and clothing. What's going on? Are people having parenting issues, financial planning issues? Are they trying to figure out how to raise teenagers or how to block social media? And you can get into deeper things that we as a church can do that is very unique, that can lead people relationally much deeper than the food, shelter, clothing as someone seen as an assembly line, that there's a touch point, but there isn't a relationship.
It's going from the do for to the do with.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I've been reading Eugene Peterson's A Pastor, a Memoir, and he was talking about there was this point where he got invited to come sit, like a therapist was teaching them. And over 2 years, they sat down and they gave him these lessons in how to do counseling and therapy, and then this group studies. And he was telling a story about a person in his congregation. He's like, I was able to use my things and fix them. He goes, but then I realized my primary purpose isn't to be a therapist. It's my job to point to the God at work within them and around in all of us. And it occurs to me, yes, we want to provide food, shelter, and clothing, but like you were saying, that's not our primary purpose. That's not uniquely ours to do. So
That's
how do
right.
we go beyond that and point to the God at work within them and all of us?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I often say, if we just want to boil it all down, we're in the relationship business. First, relationship with Christ personally, and then we're in relationship with those in our congregation, and then we need to be in relationship with the community. And too often our relationships internally use too much time, and we don't leave enough time then to do the external. So what if we even flipped those? And what if we said, our responsibility as a disciple is to be a disciple maker. And what if we went about life, not just Sunday morning for an hour, but what if life looked like, how am I meeting up with people to build a relationship that is authentic, trusting, that I might be able to tell them about the convenience store story, right? Yeah. Or why I choose to follow Jesus. But you just can't do that off the bat, right? Mm-hmm. But we have to be out building relationships with new people. Too many Christians only have Christian friends. Mm-hmm. We don't even interact with people that aren't churched or Christians already. So we have to expand our circle. Maybe we have to get out of our comfort zone, you think?
Yeah. David Crowder tells a story. He was out touring. When he was going away from the David Crowder band, kind of going solo, and he'd reworked all of his music that he'd done before into bluegrass, and they were playing bars. And he was being interviewed, and the reporter said, How do your fans react to you playing at a place where they sell beer? And David Crowder responds, well, the guy who owns this place where we're playing, that's how he makes his living, so I don't ask him to do it. And the reporter said, but Christians don't drink beer. And David Crowder responded, you need to expand your circle. That's what we need to do, right?
Exactly. I have even made mention to SPRC committees to say, I think we need to think a little differently about our expectations of where our pastors hang out. We want him to go to the Chamber of Commerce. Is everybody at the Chamber of Commerce already churched? Should they be hanging out at the bar instead in the gasp, that normally happen? But it's like, where did Jesus hang out? I think Jesus would be hanging out at the bar.
Yeah. He was basically.
That's right.
That was the scandal of eating with tax collectors and sinners.
That's right.
I was telling my congregation yesterday, I said, I can't prove this, but tax collectors were shunned by all the Jewish people, and we're not told what kind of sin the sinners at the table had committed. But my suspicion is, since all the Jews are shunning the tax collectors because they're traitors, they're probably the type of sinners you have to pay for their company.
Yes, exactly.
And this is who Jesus is. This is who Jesus is hanging out with.
That's right. But we've got to the point where we have boxed people in on where they should be hanging out because they're pastor or they're the lay leader or that kind of thing. And I think it has really limited us of building relationships beyond our normal sphere.
I would say the most convenient box is the one we put Jesus in, where we limit Jesus to that 2 hours on Sunday morning.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe it's an hour and 2 minutes, 1 minute to get into the church and 1 minute to get out, and the hour you spend in the pew. Not that I've seen that.
Yeah. That's the question how do we take Jesus out of the box?
So circling back, we're not showing Jesus very much hospitality either then.
Yeah, so true. So true.
So, Bill, how do you show Jesus more hospitality?
I think we have to recognize Christ's presence everywhere we're at and stop putting him in that box. Realize Jesus is unexplainable and way beyond our comprehension, and that, he can be a hippie too, dude.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question my 10-year-old asked me. Dad, why do we have to go to church? I mean, we can pray here and we can talk about God here, and I can do everything in church that I do in church here. So why do I have to go to church?
So how did you answer that, Dad?
I'm still working on a good answer. I came back and I landed on a version of this. I said, well, The reason that you don't want to get up and go to church has nothing to do with your feelings about God, and it's got to do with your love of sleep. And I said, part of the purpose of church and worship is to remind us that we're not God and life's not all about what we want. I was like, so getting up and going to church is one way that you can demonstrate that God is more important than the things that you love, or God's more important in your life than your own comfort.
And also, I have to wonder the experiences that people are having at church.
Yeah.
How are we creating? I mean, people have to show up willing to worship. But we also have to create an environment that's conducive to worship, with an expectation of, this isn't about a show. This isn't about a performance. This is about an opportunity to worship God. But all of this, I think, is the reason why that this movement of fresh expressions is so intriguing to people, because that's one way I think Jesus gets out of the box, is to think about it beyond a building.
Could you talk about what fresh expressions are?
I'd love to. So fresh expressions is a gathering of unchurched people. Get this, unchurched. Too often we just regather our church people and call it fresh expressions. But it's a gathering of unchurched person led by a pastor or a lay person for the purposes of gathering around a shared affinity and just doing life together and discipling together. And so it could look like canoeing on the river. It could look like working out together at the gym. It could look like gathering at the winery. I think what we have to be careful is that it isn't only about the activity, but it's the activity that we have in common that puts us at ease with one another, because we're in an enjoyable space that we want to go to. And then we begin. So for instance, the canoes, the fresh expressions that I'm familiar with in the canoe group is we all put our canoes in I don't do this. They put their canoes in the water, and then they paddle out a ways, and then they all tie up to one another, and they read a scripture and they talk about what that means to them, and they pray, and then they canoe a little bit more, and then they hit the shore, put their canoes away, and they go on about their week. But that can be church. And too often we are tied to our facilities. We think the building is church, not the experience of doing life with Jesus as the church.
I end every worship service with this phrase: stop coming to church, start coming to worship, and go out and be the church, because words matter. Words matter.
They do.
And we've created this mindset that we're going to church. But church, you're absolutely right. Church isn't a building. Church are the people.
Yeah. And too often our facilities have limited what we can do for a whole variety of reasons, especially when churches are declining, deferred maintenance. And it's just this perpetual hairball, because we've made it about the building rather than about the movement and sharing Jesus with people.
One of the things I like to think about with the building and going to worship is, in answer to your child's question, is
I need a good answer.
Is that
because I think mine was,
we go to rehearse. We're going to rehearse worshiping God in the kingdom. We're go to rehearse offering grace and hospitality inside that building. We go to rehearse all these things so that we're in a safe, comfortable place, and we can go out in the world and do it better.
Absolutely. You know, the pastor is not the paid prayer. And so even to start there, that we begin to share that responsibility. If we can't pray in the safety of our congregation or a small group or the SPRC team, how are we going to pray with a person outside? So you're absolutely right. That's where we need to be taught and rehearse what we're going to share with the world. And so it even goes in, can you imagine starting choir practice with the question, so where'd you see Jesus this week? Trustees, we start, where'd you see Jesus this week? If these are the leaders of our church and we begin to model it, how are we going to tell people about Jesus outside if we're not comfortable doing it inside the church?
Or even moving choir practice to the local pizza parlor.
You bet.
Wouldn't that be cool?
You bet. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, it depends on how good the choir is.
Well, that's true too. That would be
we're the pizza parlor.
That's true.
Or the bar.
Right, or the bar. That's right. You know, I do a fresh expression. I do something called Bible and a Brew, and we play a little music, do a little Bible study, some fellowship, and we haven't been able to really attract the non-churched as much as we'd like to. But the benefit I've found is people will talk to me as a pastor about things in that setting they never would talk to me about
Absolutely.
in the church, even in the privacy of my own office.
Yeah. Yeah. And why do you think that is?
It's because of the setting.
Yeah.
We're doing life together.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think we do much of that anymore, doing life together. And I think that's some of the issues with our neighborhoods is we're not willing to get our hands dirty, metaphorically and literally, to be the neighbor we are called to be.
We like to end our shows with this question. What is saving your soul right now? And Jesus is a given because we know Jesus has saved your soul. But what is it that's actively saving your soul right now?
Well, I go back to what I said earlier. Because I work across denominational lines and with so many pastors and churches, you could get mired down in what's going on in the denomination right now and be depressed. I've just seen that in too many colleagues. And Jesus is bigger than all of this. And I just continually think about the decreasing number of people that know Jesus. And so that's what my driver is we need to be figuring out how more people come to know Jesus and follow Jesus than whatever goes on in the denomination. I mean, we all have our personal opinions about that, and so be it. But regardless of what happens, we're in a world that needs to know, and we've been keeping it a secret. And so that's what keeps me going at this point is knowing that and that be the heartbeat of everything that we do.
Yeah. So you've written a number of books. Do you have any projects or anything that you're working on right now, or any ways for people to connect with you if they want to find out more?
We just dropped a book a couple of weeks ago, and that's called Launching Leaders. And I co-wrote that with Phil Schrader out of the North Georgia Conference. The reason for that book, I always say, I don't write books just to write books. There's always a need for that resource. Too many churches don't have an intentional faith development process. And so this is to help you figure out, it's nominations and lay leadership development. And so it's a process to help them. Here in the Arkansas Conference, we have a couple of things going on. The one that is just getting ready to roll out is one that we're calling impact groups. And so this is an opportunity for the pastor and lay people in a given congregation to come together around where laity can have impact in their local congregation. So how can they reclaim the role of lay ministry? So there's different topics around worship or leadership that we give them guided questions. I just think it's a time and a place where people can come and have conversations that there seems to be no other place or format for them to have. And out of that, we hope that something springs up that revitalizes or gives them kind of a new direction and maybe even just a new energy to be the church.
Yeah. Thanks. And Bill will put links to all that in the show notes because Bill does
everything.
90% of the work.
That's a fair number. Thank you, Kay. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.